The scream that shattered the marble-walled lobby of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel wasn't human. It was something primal, desperate, the sound a mother makes when her world collapses in real time. Sarah Martinez Johnson's voice cracked as she watched uniformed officers pull her 7-year-old daughter from her arms. The child's small fingers clawing frantically at her mother's sleeve before losing their grip entirely. "Mommy." Emma's cry echoed off the crystal chandeliers as a female officer carried her toward the hotel's conference room. "I want my mommy." 30 feet away, Marcus Johnson stood frozen against the concierge desk, his hands raised despite no one asking him to do so. His 10-year-old son David pressed against his father's legs, tears streaming down his face as more officers approached. The boy had inherited his mother's olive skin and his father's dark eyes, creating a beautiful blend that had always made strangers smile. Today, those same features seemed to mark him as evidence in a crime that didn't exist. "Sir, we need you to step away from the child," Officer Mitchell said, his hand resting on his radio. His voice carried the practiced authority of someone who'd handled countless domestic situations, but his eyes held confusion as he took in the scene. Marcus felt his world tilt sideways. "That's my son. This is my family. What's happening here?" The call had come in 18 minutes earlier. A concerned citizen reporting a possible kidnapping in progress at the Grand Metropolitan. The caller, identifying herself as Patricia Whitmore, had spoken with the breathless urgency of someone witnessing a crime. She'd described seeing a black man and a Hispanic woman with 2 children who didn't look like they belonged with them. The children seemed distressed, she'd claimed. The situation looked suspicious. Now, as chaos erupted in the 5-star lobby, Patricia Whitmore watched from behind a marble pillar. Her manicured fingers clutched around her phone. She'd been staying at the Grand Metropolitan for 3 days, attending her college reunion, when she'd spotted the family checking into the penthouse suite. The sight had gnawed at her throughout her continental breakfast, through her spa appointment, through her afternoon tea. A black man and a Latina woman with children, occupying the suite that cost more per night than most people made in a month. It didn't sit right with her. But it wasn't just the money that bothered Patricia. It was the way they moved through the space, as if they belonged there. The way the concierge smiled at them. The way other guests nodded politely as they passed. It challenged something fundamental in her understanding of how the world should work, and she'd decided to do something about it. Sarah had met Marcus 8 years ago at a medical conference in Chicago. She was a pediatric surgeon, fresh out of her residency at Northwestern. He was a tech entrepreneur, 3 years into building what would become a multi-million-dollar software company. Their first conversation had lasted 4 hours, spanning everything from their shared love of jazz music to their similar experiences of being the first in their families to attend graduate school. Their wedding had been a celebration of 2 cultures, 2 families, and 2 people who'd found in each other something they hadn't known they were missing. Sarah's grandmother had taught Marcus to make authentic tamales. Marcus's mother had shown Sarah how to braid Emma's hair in the intricate patterns passed down through generations of Johnson women. Their children grew up bilingual, bicultural, and blessed with the kind of love that made other parents envious at school pickup. This weekend was supposed to be their 8th wedding anniversary. They'd driven 3 hours from their suburban home, leaving work and obligations behind for 48 hours of room service, couples massages, and uninterrupted conversation. The penthouse suite had been Marcus's surprise, booked months in advance, and paid for with the bonus from his company's latest acquisition. "We've never stayed anywhere this fancy," Sarah had whispered as they'd entered the suite that morning, her eyes wide as she took in the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Marcus had pulled her close, spinning her around the marble entryway. "We've earned it. Both of us. We work hard. We love hard. And we deserve to celebrate that." The children had been thrilled with their own adjoining room, complete with bunk beds and a game console. Emma had immediately claimed the top bunk, while David had set up his sketchpad at the window, drawing the cityscape below with the careful attention of a child who saw beauty everywhere. They'd spent the afternoon at the hotel's rooftop pool, a family of 4 among dozens of other families. The children had played with other kids in the shallow end, while Sarah and Marcus lounged in cabana chairs. Their fingers intertwined as they watched their son teach a younger boy how to do a proper cannonball. "Look at them," Sarah had murmured, nodding toward the children. "They don't see differences. They just see friends." "Maybe we're raising them right," Marcus had replied, squeezing her hand. Patricia Whitmore had been watching from her own cabana, her gaze sharp and calculating as she observed the family's interactions. She'd noted how comfortable they seemed, how the staff treated them with the same deference shown to all VIP guests. It reinforced her growing conviction that something was wrong with this picture. The afternoon had turned to evening, and the family had returned to their suite to prepare for dinner. They'd planned to eat at the hotel's Michelin-starred restaurant, another splurge to mark their anniversary. Sarah had packed a special dress for the occasion, while Marcus had brought the cufflinks his father had worn to his own wedding 40 years earlier. But as they'd made their way through the lobby toward the restaurant, Patricia had made her move. "Excuse me," she'd said, approaching them with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I couldn't help but notice your beautiful children. Are they adopted?" The question had hung in the air like a slap. Sarah's hand had instinctively moved to Emma's shoulder, while Marcus had stepped slightly forward, his body language shifting into something more protective. "There are children," Sarah had replied, her voice carefully neutral. Patricia's smile had widened, but something predatory had flickered in her expression. "Oh, I just assumed. They're just so lucky to have found such a loving family." The implication was clear. The children couldn't possibly be theirs biologically. The combination of their features, the blending of their parents' heritage, was something Patricia couldn't or wouldn't accept as natural. "We need to get to dinner," Marcus had said, his voice tight with controlled anger. But Patricia hadn't been finished. "It's just so wonderful when people like you give children like them opportunities they might not otherwise have." The lobby had seemed to grow quieter, other guests glancing their way as the tension became palpable. Emma had pressed closer to her mother, sensing the change in atmosphere, even if she didn't understand its source. "Come on," Sarah had whispered to her family, guiding them away from Patricia and toward the restaurant entrance. But Patricia had watched them go, her mind already working. The way they'd reacted to her innocent questions had confirmed her suspicions. Normal parents would have laughed off such confusion, would have explained the obvious genetic inheritance their children displayed. Instead, they'd grown defensive, suspicious. They were hiding something. By the time the family had finished their appetizers, Patricia had constructed an entire narrative in her mind. She'd convinced herself that she'd witnessed the early stages of a crime, that those children were in danger, that she had a moral obligation to act. The call to 911 had felt like a civic duty. Now, as police officers separated parents from children in the hotel lobby, Patricia felt a surge of vindication. She'd been right to trust her instincts. The authorities were taking her seriously, treating the situation with the gravity it deserved. "Ma'am, I need you to remain calm," Officer Rodriguez was saying to Sarah, who had begun hyperventilating as Emma disappeared into the conference room. "We're going to sort this out, but we need everyone to cooperate." Sort what out? Sarah's voice cracked with desperation. Those are our children. We have their birth certificates upstairs. We have photos of them as babies. We have their medical records in my name. But the officers had their protocol. A child endangerment call required immediate separation of the alleged perpetrators from the potential victims. Questions could be asked later, after the children were safe. Marcus found himself in handcuffs, not because he was under arrest, but because he'd instinctively moved toward his son when the officers approached. The gesture had been misinterpreted as aggressive, and now he sat in the hotel's security office while Detective Sandra Walsh reviewed the incident report. Mr. Johnson, Detective Walsh began, her voice professional but not unkind. I need you to help me understand what's happening here. The caller was very specific about her concerns. The caller is wrong, Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. Those children are biologically ours. Sarah gave birth to both of them. I was there for both deliveries. We've been a family for 10 years. Detective Walsh studied his face, looking for tells that might indicate deception. She'd handled hundreds of cases involving child welfare, and she'd learned to read people quickly. But Marcus Johnson didn't fit any of the patterns she'd come to recognize. His distress seemed genuine, his answers consistent, his demeanor that of a concerned father rather than someone with something to hide. The children seem very attached to you both, she admitted. Emma keeps asking for her mommy, and David won't stop talking about how he wants to show you his drawing from this afternoon. Because we're their parents, Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly. They're scared and confused, and they need us. In the conference room, Sarah sat across from a child psychologist who'd been called in to evaluate the situation. Emma clung to her mother's hand while David remained pressed against her side, both children traumatized by the sudden separation from their father. Can you tell me about your family, Doctor? Lisa Chen asked gently, her approach designed to put the children at ease. That's my mommy, Emma said, pointing to Sarah. And Daddy's the one the police took away. Why did they take Daddy? Doctor, Chen exchanged a glance with Sarah, who was fighting back tears as she watched her daughter struggle to make sense of the situation. Sometimes grown-ups get confused, Dr. Chen explained carefully. They think they're helping, but they make mistakes. Can you tell me about your daddy? David looked up from where he'd been drawing on a piece of paper Dr. Chen had provided. Daddy teaches me about computers and helps me with my math homework. He makes funny voices when he reads us bedtime stories. And your mommy? Mommy fixes people's hearts, Emma chimed in, her voice proud despite her tears. She saves kids at the hospital. She saved a baby last week who was born too early. Dr. Chen had seen enough child welfare cases to recognize authentic relationships. The children's responses were natural, detailed, filled with the kind of specific memories that couldn't be fabricated or coached. Their emotional responses to the separation were also telling. This was clearly a traumatic disruption of their normal family structure, not a rescue from a dangerous situation. Meanwhile, hotel security was reviewing surveillance footage at Detective Walsh's request. The footage told a clear story, the family checking in together, laughing as they waited for the elevator, the children running ahead while their parents followed with luggage. Later footage showed them at the pool, at dinner, moving through the hotel with the easy familiarity of people who belong together. There's nothing here that suggests anything inappropriate, Security Chief Tom Bradley reported to Detective Walsh. If anything, they look like the most functional family we've had stay here in months. But the most revealing footage was from earlier that evening, The cameras had captured Patricia's interaction with the family in the lobby, her pointed questions, their uncomfortable responses. Audio wasn't available, but body language told the story clearly, an unwelcome confrontation that had left the family unsettled. "Who's this woman?" Detective Walsh asked, pointing to Patricia on the screen. "Patricia Whitmore, room 847, Bradley replied. "She's the one who made the call." Detective Walsh studied Patricia's face on the monitor, noting the satisfied expression as police cars had arrived at the hotel. Most people who called in emergencies looked worried, anxious, hoping they were wrong about their suspicions. Patricia Whitmore looked vindicated. "I'd like to speak with Ms. Whitmore," Detective Walsh decided. Patricia was waiting in the hotel bar when Detective Walsh found her, sipping a martini and checking her phone with the casual air of someone whose evening plans had gone exactly as expected. "Ms. Whitmore, Detective Sandra Walsh, I'd like to ask you some questions about the call you made this evening." Patricia straightened in her chair, her expression becoming serious and civic-minded. "Of course, Detective. I was happy to do my civic duty. You can never be too careful when it comes to children's safety. Can you walk me through exactly what you observed that led you to call 911? Patricia launched into her account with the rehearsed precision of someone who'd been mentally preparing her story. She described suspicious behavior, children who seemed uncomfortable, adults who appeared to be controlling their movements. But as she spoke, Detective Walsh noticed inconsistencies, embellishments that didn't match the surveillance footage she'd just reviewed. "You mentioned the children seemed distressed," Detective Walsh interrupted. "Can you be specific about what you observed?" Patricia hesitated for just a moment, but it was enough. "Well, they were quiet, subdued, not like normal children at all. But the footage showed laughing children, kids running and playing, Emma doing cartwheels in the lobby, while her parents watched with obvious affection." "Ms. Whitmore, had you interacted with this family before making your call?" Another hesitation. "I may have spoken with them briefly, just being friendly." "What did you talk about?" Patricia's story began to unravel as Detective Walsh pressed for details. The friendly conversation revealed itself as something more pointed, more invasive. Patricia's assumptions about adoption, her comments about people like them, and children like those, painted a clear picture of motivations that had nothing to do with child safety. "Ms. Whitmore," Detective Walsh said finally, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "Making false reports to emergency services is a serious crime. It wastes resources, traumatizes innocent people, and in this case, has separated children from their parents based on nothing more than your personal biases." Patricia's composure began to crack. "I was trying to help. Something didn't seem right about the situation." What didn't seem right? A family enjoying their vacation, children playing with their parents. Or was it something else that bothered you about seeing a black man, a Latina woman, and their mixed-race children staying in a penthouse suite? The accusation hung in the air between them. Patricia's face flushed red, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for a response that wouldn't incriminate her further. "That's not... I never said anything about race," she stammered. "You didn't have to," Detective Walsh replied. "Your actions speak loudly enough." By midnight, the family had been reunited in their suite. The children had finally stopped crying, exhausted by the emotional trauma of the evening. Emma fell asleep in her parents' bed, while David curled up in a chair nearby, unwilling to be separated from his family, even by a closed door. Sarah and Marcus sat on the couch, holding each other as they processed what had happened. The romantic anniversary they'd planned had become a nightmare neither of them would ever forget. "How do we explain this to them?" Sarah whispered, nodding toward the children. "How do we tell them that someone looked at our family and saw something wrong?" Marcus pulled her closer, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "We tell them the truth, that some people in this world carry hatred in their hearts, but that doesn't make them right. We tell them that we love them, that we're a family, and that nobody can change that." "I keep thinking about Emma's face when they pulled her away from me," Sarah continued. "She was so scared. She didn't understand why strangers were separating us." "She'll understand when she's older," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "Maybe she'll understand that this happened not because of anything we did wrong, but because we live in a world where love sometimes looks threatening to people who can't see past their own prejudices." The next morning brought phone calls from their lawyer, meetings with hotel management, and formal statements to be signed. The Grand Metropolitan's general manager, James Harrison, had arrived before dawn to personally apologize and ensure the family's needs were met. "This is not who we are as a hotel," he told them over breakfast in their suite. "We pride ourselves on being a welcoming place for all families, and what happened last night violates everything we stand for." But the damage was done. Emma refused to leave the suite, afraid that police would come again. David had stopped drawing, his usual creative outlet silenced by the trauma of watching his father handcuffed and led away. The joy had been sucked out of their anniversary weekend, replaced by a shared trauma that would take months to process. Detective Walsh returned that afternoon with news about the charges being filed against Patricia Whitmore. False reporting, public endangerment, and misuse of emergency services would likely result in significant fines and community service. But the family had also decided to pursue a civil lawsuit, both for the emotional trauma inflicted on their children and to send a message about the consequences of weaponizing emergency services against innocent families. Patricia Whitmore will face the full consequences of her actions, Detective Walsh assured them. This kind of behavior is unacceptable, and the district attorney's office is committed to prosecuting it to the full extent of the law. 2 weeks later, the story had spread beyond local news. The hotel's security footage, released with the family's permission, showed the clear sequence of events: Patricia's confrontation, the family's discomfort, and the arrival of police responding to a call based entirely on racial prejudice. The video went viral, sparking conversations about the weaponization of emergency services and the ongoing effects of systemic racism on families of color. Patricia Whitmore found herself at the center of a national controversy. Her employer, a prestigious marketing firm, terminated her after the footage surfaced. Her college alumni association revoked her membership. Major hotel chains across the country banned her from their properties, creating a database to ensure she couldn't repeat her behavior elsewhere. But the most powerful moment came during the court hearing for her civil lawsuit. Patricia was required to stand before the family and the packed courtroom to offer a public apology. "I was wrong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she faced Marcus, Sarah, Emma, and David. "I let my own prejudices and assumptions drive me to make a call that traumatized innocent children and separated a loving family. There is no excuse for my actions." Emma watched from her mother's lap, her 7-year-old mind trying to process the sight of the woman who had caused so much pain, now looking small and defeated. David sat beside his father, sketching in a notebook he'd finally picked up again, his artistic voice slowly returning after weeks of silence. I cannot undo the harm I've caused. Patricia continued, tears streaming down her face. But I can commit to examining my own biases, to doing better, to ensuring that I never again let fear and prejudice drive me to hurt innocent people. The judge, the Honorable Margaret Kim, had seen many cases of false reporting during her years on the bench. But few had involved such clear evidence of racial motivation, and fewer still had resulted in the traumatization of children. Ms. Whitmore, Judge Kim said, her voice carrying the weight of authority, your actions represent more than just a false report. You weaponized the emergency response system against a family whose only crime was existing in a space where you felt they didn't belong. The trauma you inflicted on these children will have lasting effects. The financial judgment was substantial restitution for therapy costs for the children, compensation for the family's emotional distress, and punitive damages designed to send a message. But more importantly, Patricia was ordered to complete extensive bias training, to perform community service with organizations fighting racial injustice, and to speak publicly about the consequences of prejudice-based emergency calls. 6 months later, the Martinez-Johnson family returned to the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, not because they wanted to relive the trauma, but because they refused to let Patricia Whitmore's actions rob them of the joy they'd found in that space before her intervention. The hotel staff, many of whom remembered the incident, went out of their way to ensure the family felt welcomed. The same concierge who had smiled at them months earlier now greeted them like old friends. The restaurant manager personally ensured their dinner was perfect. The housekeeping staff left small gifts for the children, tokens of apology for what they'd witnessed in the lobby that terrible night. Look, Emma said, pointing out the window of their penthouse suite at the city skyline below. It's just as pretty as I remembered. David had set up his art supplies at the same window where he'd drawn before. But this time, his subject was different. Instead of buildings and sky, he was drawing his family 4 figures holding hands, surrounded by hearts and flowers, with the words, "Love wins," written in careful 7-year-old script across the top. "Are you okay being back here?" Sarah asked Marcus, as they watched their children reclaim the space that had once been turned against them. "I think we had to come back," Marcus replied, "to prove to ourselves and to them that love is stronger than hate, that families like ours don't have to hide or apologize for existing." That evening, as they walked through the lobby toward dinner, they passed the spot where Patricia had confronted them months earlier. The memory was still sharp, still painful, but it no longer held the power to diminish their joy in being together. Other families moved through the lobby around them, couples of all races, children of every background, love in every possible configuration. The Grand Metropolitan had always been a place where diverse families felt welcome, but now there was an extra layer of intentionality to that inclusivity, a recognition of how precious and fragile safety could be for families who didn't fit traditional molds. Emma skipped ahead, no longer afraid that uniformed officers would appear to separate her from her parents. David walked beside his father, describing the new drawing he planned to create of the hotel's architecture. Sarah linked her arm through Marcus's, both of them older and wiser than they'd been 6 months earlier, but no less committed to building a world where their children could exist without apology. The evening news that night carried a follow-up story about the case. Patricia Whitmore had completed her community service and bias training. She'd spoken at several conferences about the dangers of prejudice-motivated emergency calls. Her life had been fundamentally changed by the consequences of her actions, but she'd used that change to become an advocate for the very families she'd once targeted. "Redemption is possible," she said in her interview with the local station, "but it requires acknowledging the full extent of the harm caused. taking responsibility for that harm, and committing to doing better every single day. I can never undo what I did to the Martinez-Johnson family, but I can spend the rest of my life working to ensure no other family experiences what they did. The story ended where it began, in the Grand Metropolitan's marble-walled lobby. But this time, the sounds echoing off the crystal chandeliers were laughter and conversation. The comfortable noise of families at ease, in a space where they belonged. The Martinez-Johnson family was among them, no longer victims of someone else's hatred, but survivors who had turned their trauma into a catalyst for change. As they entered the restaurant for their anniversary dinner, delayed by 6 months, but no less meaningful, Sarah and Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them back to this moment. The road had been painful, marked by tears and legal battles, and sleepless nights spent comforting traumatized children. But it had also revealed the strength of their love, the resilience of their family, and the power of a community that refused to let hatred win. Emma ordered chocolate cake for dessert, her laughter bright and unafraid as she described her plans for the next day. David showed the waiter his latest drawing, proud to share his art with someone new. And their parents watched, hearts full of gratitude for the simple joy of being together in a world that was slowly, imperfectly, but steadily learning to make room for all families to exist and thrive. The final lesson of their ordeal wasn't about the capacity for human cruelty, though they'd seen plenty of that. It was about the greater capacity for human resilience, for love to triumph over fear, and for justice to prevail when good people refused to remain silent in the face of injustice. They were still the same family they'd always been loving, committed, proud of their heritage and their children. But now, they were also something more, symbols of hope for other families facing similar challenges. Proof that hate might wound, but could never ultimately destroy the bonds that truly matter. The Grand Metropolitan Hotel would always hold complex memories for them. But tonight, as they celebrated their love surrounded by the warm glow of candlelight and the comfortable murmur of other diners, it felt like what it had always been meant to be, a place where love could flourish without apology, where families of all kinds could find welcome, and where the future promised to be brighter than the past.